How can Mission Command succeed when your plan doesn't? We look at Lord Horatio Nelson and the Battle of Tenerife.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Principles of War podcast. This is episode 59, Amphibious Operations and Mission Command with Nelson at the Battle of Tenerife. This is the fourth episode in our Nelson series looking at Mission Command. I was going to speak briefly about the Battle of Tenerife, but I think there's a couple of really interesting lessons that we can pull out from it, particularly about Mission Command. The references for this episode: Andrew Lambert's excellent Britannia's God of War, Terry Coleman's excellent The Nelson Touch, and for something a little bit different, Alfred Thayer Mahan's The Life of Nelson. All really good reads. So to put the Battle of Tenerife in context, we are about 5 months after the Battle of Cape St. Vincent. Old Jarvie is now the first Earl of St. Vincent, and his career would continue to flourish. He would go on to be Admiral of the Fleet, which is a Field Marshal equivalent. And I think in some degrees it certainly highlights the fact that it is very helpful having a mentor who is going to be successful in their own right, in their own career, to help you with your career. And Nelson, at various points in his life, benefited from the influence of a number of mentors that he had in his career. Nelson himself has been promoted to Rear Admiral in the fleet. So that's a Major General equivalent. He is only 39 years old. So not too bad an effort for his career so far. Now, his promotion to Rear Admiral, that came about according to seniority, not because of his performance at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent. Now, today we're going to go into a territory which is a little bit unfamiliar for Nelson, and that is amphibious operations. He had spent some time in the land domain, particularly in South America, but as we'll see, planning and the conduct of amphibious operations is quite a complex task. From our doctrine, we know that there are 5 different types of amphibious operations. There are amphibious demonstrations, raids, assaults, withdrawals, and amphib activities in support of other operations. The best example of an amphibious demonstration would be the United States Marine Corps in Gulf War I, where positioned off the coast, they were able to fixate the gaze of the Republican Guard and ensure that their defences were orientated in the wrong direction. Amphibious raids are limited by time and space, and it includes the planned withdrawal of the landing force. Examples would be Special Forces raids into Norway in World War II and the Dieppe raid. An amphibious assault is a decisive action to achieve objectives involving a degree of permanency on an uncertain or hostile shore. Examples include the British landings during the Falklands War at San Carlos, D-Day, and the landing of Australia's 9th Division in September 1943 at Lae. When we think of amphibious withdrawal, there is of course Gallipoli, with the withdrawal from the Gallipoli Peninsula being much more successful than the initial assault. And we also think of Dunkirk. However, that was only one of a series of amphibious withdrawals that were conducted in order to allow the BEF to continue the fight from England. Lastly, we have operations requiring amphibious support, and they can be humanitarian operations, peace operations, or non-combatant evacuation operations. A great example would have been the use of HMAS Choules to evacuate civilians from Malakuta during the Victorian bushfires. Amphibious operations, by their very nature, are the most complex operations that can be conducted. Amphibious operations are truly joint operations. And with that comes an incredible amount of complexity in providing the coordination and orchestration of effects. We also need to think about how we are going to sustain the forces that we put ashore. This complexity is compounded by the impact of weather and tides in the AO. But amphibious operation planners trade off this increased complexity for the benefits of flexibility, surprise, and the ability to concentrate their forces. Nelson, in July 1797, was planning on using a lot of surprise, local concentration of force, and just a lot of audacity to raid Tenerife. The Spanish Viceroy of Mexico had been bringing treasure ships back to Spain from Veracruz and Cuba. Ideally, the Spanish would have sallied out from Cadiz to bring the treasure ships home safely, which would have allowed the Royal Navy the fleet action that they wanted. But this was becoming increasingly unlikely. The war that Britain was fighting was costing a fortune, and the impact on the financial system was incredibly severe, so much so that it had actually created a run on the banks. Bank payments in gold and silver were suspended, and captured Spanish silver dollars were issued as legal tender from March 1797. The Tenerife raid was to aid this situation. The plan was to liberate 6 to 7 million pounds sterling that could then be put into circulation in England. If they could pull the raid off, the prize money would have been £375,000 to St. Vincent and £45,000 to Nelson. That works out to be about £6 million in today's money. The £6 million in bullion that they were hoping to get works over to be £750 million. That is quite a lot of money. There was a precedent for this. In 1656, Richard Stainer, serving under General at Sea Robert Blake, General at Sea being a rank in the English Parliamentary Navy, roughly equivalent of admiral. In September, Stainer fell in with a Spanish treasure fleet and sunk 3 ships, was able to capture one of them. That had somewhere between £600,000 and not what the Spanish were reporting of being £2 million sterling. This haul was so significant that a Thanksgiving service was ordered to be held in all of the churches in London and Westminster. The next year, Robert Blake aimed to follow up on his success by raiding the harbour at Santa Cruz de Tenerife. Now, Rear Admiral Stainer led 12 frigates in who engaged the ships in the harbour, whilst Blake sailed in and engaged the Spanish batteries and forts that were providing protection to the ships in the harbour. The Spanish had 12 ships burnt and another 5 captured, which were later destroyed, but the Royal Navy suffered no shipping losses and just 48 men killed and 120 wounded. One historian wrote, "The whole action was so miraculous that all men who knew the place wondered that any sober man with what courage soever endowed would ever have undertaken it, and they could hardly persuade themselves to believe that it had been done, whilst the Spanish comforted themselves with the belief that they were devils and not men who had destroyed them in such manner." That was the precedent that Lord Nelson was looking at, and he actually wrote to Admiral Sir John Jarvis and said, "I do not reckon myself equal to Blake," as he went on to discuss the plan for his own attack. Mahan, in his history, writes that too much success is not wholly desirable. An occasional beating is good for men and nations. Nelson understood the difficulties that he was going to face, and he wanted to make this a joint operation. He was keen to get the army involved, but they weren't interested. Nelson wrote that soldiers have not the same boldness in undertaking a political measure that we have. We look to the benefit of our country and risk our own fame every day to serve her. A soldier obeys his orders and no more. Now, was Nelson being a little bit harsh on our redcoat friends, or was he justified in his critique of their reticence to support the joint operation? I think there's a couple of things to think about here. Firstly, the complexity that naval officers often had to deal with in their AO. As a relatively junior captain, we saw that in our first episode about Nelson, the negotiations that he was conducting around trade embargoes with the Americans, requiring him to negotiate really at quite a strategic level. naval officers operating in independent commands where communications could take months and months to send a question and to receive the answer. So independence was something that was a little bit more commonplace within naval officers than potentially their army officers. Of course, communications was a lot more difficult. However, there were probably less independent commands for army officers. The other factor I think is important to think about is, of course, prize money. Now, prize money, not something that factors often in decision-making for army officers, especially now that sacking and looting is heavily frowned upon. There is no formal prize system available for army officers. Nonetheless, St. Vincent learns that the Príncipe de Asturias lays at Tenerife, and so the raid is on. On the 14th of July, Nelson sets sail from the Canaries. He's got 3 74s, 3 frigates, a cutter, and a mortar boat. The 74s are his flagship, HMS Theseus with Captain Miller. There's also HMS Culloden under Captain Trowbridge, and HMS Zealous with Captain Hood. That is Samuel Hood, later to be Admiral Sir Samuel Hood, not to be confused with his brother, Captain Alexander Hood, his cousin once removed, Admiral Samuel Hood, the first Viscount Hood, nor his other cousin once removed, Admiral Alexander Hood, the first Viscount Bridport, nor his brother's grandson, the Admiral Lord Hood. As you can see, quite a famous naval family. Hood is working with Nelson for the first time, but Captain Miller had been in HMA as captain with Nelson at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, and Trowbridge had been in Culloden. We're starting to see that formation of what Nelson referred to as his band of brothers. His 3 frigates, he's got HMS Seahorse, HMS Emerald, and HMS Terpsichore. Seahorse, 38 guns, commanded by Captain Fremantle, and Terpsichore under Bowen with 32 guns. Now, the one interesting addition with his frigates, Captain Fremantle brought his newly married wife along for the cruise. Not only were they newly married, but she was pregnant as well. So this sounds like an amazing idea for a honeymoon. They also had a cutter and a mortar boat that they would use to provide naval gunfire support for the raid. Each of the 74s supplied 200 sailors and marines, and the frigates supplied 100. So in total, there was 900 troops to go ashore. Now, before we hit the beach, I think there's one important area that we should have a look at. Miller and Nelson had not been long on HMS Theseus. In fact, they'd only been there for a month, and the reason for that is quite important. And I think it highlights one element of Nelson's leadership, the Nelson touch, that doesn't get a lot of airing, but I think is really important, something we can all learn from. We mentioned the Spithead and Nore mutinies in a previous episode. These occurred just around this time, in June. Old Jarvie had taken command of the Mediterranean fleet in 1795, so about 2 years prior to this time. When Old Jarvie had taken command of the Mediterranean fleet, he'd got his handover from Vice Admiral Sir Samuel Hood, and his leadership style was described as quite easygoing. Andrew Lambert, in Nelson, Britannia's God of War, describes how the Mediterranean fleet was transformed. New ships and men, drilled into professional fighting machines by constant exercise, transformed his small fleet into the most effective fighting force on the planet. Jarvis's fleet would set the world an example of skill, discipline, and subordination. It had never lacked the first quality, but the 2 latter were entirely absent when he arrived. These were the methods of a new age, the age of total war. With the mass armies of revolutionary France rampaging across Europe, only a revitalised fleet could resist the threat of a pan-European fleet, French, Dutch, Spanish and more. This Mediterranean fleet discipline was the terror of the service and its salvation. Nelson was at one with him and accordingly sent to restore order on that abomination, the newly arrived Theseus. Nelson admired Jarvis's concern to impose sound, thoughtful administration to preserve the health and welfare of his men, select and reward the dedicated professional officers, and keep his ships efficient and prepared for long cruises at any moment. So Nelson learnt a lot under the command of Jarvis, and he would seek to emulate what he'd learnt and his style of leadership when he had his own fleet command. In 1801, when Nelson was given command of the Baltic Fleet, he would use the same administration and organisation system as Jarvis. The standing orders that Nelson issued were based largely on Jarvis's standing orders, a copy of which he had kept for reference. The problem for Jarvis and Nelson was that the mutinous spirit from Spithead and the Nore had spread to the Mediterranean fleet. 4 men on HMS George were hanged on a Sunday, and Jarvis thought that this was due to lax officers. When his second-in-command, Admiral Charles Thompson, raised concerns about hanging on Sundays, the Sabbath, Jarvis objected and sent a complaint to the Board of the Admiralty, demanding that he be removed from command or that he would submit his own resignation. Thompson was duly removed. Against the British at Santa Cruz de Tenerife was Lieutenant General Antonio Guterres de Otero y Santillana. He had 91 guns emplaced in a series of forts and emplacements, and he had around 1,600 men. These were made up of 800 trained soldiers, 110 French sailors, and about 700 of the local militia. On the way to Tenerife, Nelson held 4 conferences where he called his captains in to discuss what the plan was to be. This is something that he had learned from Lord Hood. And you can see how he has benefited from picking up the components of his leadership style from the superiors that he served under. He worked most closely with Trowbridge on the plan, and it was to be Trowbridge who would lead the assault. These are the orders that Nelson issued to Trowbridge from the Theseus at sea, July 20, 1797. Sir, I desire you will take under your command the number of seamen and marines named in the margin, who will be landed under Captains Hood, Miller, Fremantle, Bowen and Waller, and the marines under Captain Thomas Oldfield, and a detachment of the Royal Artillery under Lieutenant Baines, all of whom are now embarked on board His Majesty's frigates Seahorse, Terpsichore and Emerald. With this detachment, you will proceed as near to the town of Santa Cruz as possible, without endangering your being perceived. When you will embark as many men as the boats will carry, and force your landing into the northeast part of the Bay of Santa Cruz near a large battery. The moment you are on shore, I recommend you first to attack the battery, which when carried and your post secured, you will either proceed by storm against the town and Molehead battery, or send in my letter as you judge most proper, containing a summons of which I send you a copy, and the terms are either to be accepted or rejected in the time specified, unless you see good cause for prolonging it, as no alterations will be made in them, and you will pursue such other methods as you judge most proper for speedily effecting my orders, which are to possess myself of all cargoes and treasures which may be landed in the island of Tenerife. Having the firmest confidence in the ability, bravery, and zeal of yourself and of all placed under your command, I have only heartily to wish you success and to assure you that I am your most obedient and faithful servant, Horatio Nelson. Well, that's certainly an interesting set of orders, and I'm just wondering how much of it is different because of the 220 years between the time that they were issued and now, and the difference between naval orders and army orders. It details who is going to carry out the mission. Trowbridge will be in command, and it details the forces that he'll have with him. It doesn't actually state when the mission is to take place. That might have been something that would have been discussed between the two of them. It mentions where, in the northeast part of the Bay of Santa Cruz, near a large battery. There's a restriction given to Trowbridge. Nelson doesn't want him to be conducting any actions that are going to endanger him being discovered before they're able to effect their attack. It starts to get interesting, though, when we talk about the what. So Trowbridge is to land his force, and then after that, I recommend you first attack the battery. Then you can either storm the battery, secure the town, send in my letter. When you send in the letter, it's either going to be accepted or rejected. There's a time specified for getting an answer to the orders. That won't be altered unless you see a good cause for prolonging it. So it is actually quite loose in what is needed to be done. In fact, it gets looser than that. And you will pursue such other methods as you judge most proper for speedily effecting my orders. And this is where we get into the interesting component of mission command, the why. To possess myself of all cargoes and treasures which may be landed in the island of Tenerife. This is because Nelson understands full well that the picture of the enemy is not complete, so there could be some surprises. The actions of the enemy are unknown. There's a most likely course of action that they're going to take, and in Nelson's mind, this is that they will surrender all of the loot. But there's a range of actions that they could take, and Trowbridge is going to be the man on the spot. He will need to take action as required. Trust is a key component of mission command, and Nelson finishes the orders with having the firmest confidence in the ability, bravery, and zeal of yourself and of all placed under your command. I have only heartily to wish you success and to assure you that I am your most obedient and faithful servant. Trowbridge should feel very confident that he has the widest left and right of arc of actions possible to him in order to achieve Nelson's mission. Nelson's summons to the commander of Santa Cruz de Tenerife is just as interesting. Sir, I have the honour to acquaint you that I am come to demand the immediate surrender of the ship El Prince de Asturias from Manila bound for Cadiz belonging to the Philippine Company, together with her whole and entire cargo, and also all such cargoes and property as may have been landed in the island of Tenerife and not intended for the consumption of the inhabitants. And as it is my earnest wish that not one individual inhabitant of the island of Tenerife should suffer by my demand being instantly complied with, I offer the following most honourable and liberal terms, which, if refused, the horrors of war that will fall on the inhabitants of Tenerife must be by the world imputed to you and you only, for I shall destroy Santa Cruz and the other towns in the island by a bombardment and levy a very heavy contribution on the island. Amphibious operations are incredibly complex operations, and to assist in the understanding of everyone and the part that they would play in the operation, Nelson issued some regulations. First, that the boats of each ship should be kept together by towing each other, which will keep the people of each ship collected, and the boats in 6 divisions will be nearly got on shore at the same moment. Secondly, the marines of each ship of the line to be put in their launches, which will carry them. Thirdly, the moment the boats are discovered by a firing being made on them, the bomb vessel to commence her own firing on the town and to keep it up until the flag of truce is hoisted from either the enemy or from us. Fourthly, that a captain should be directed to see the boats put off from the beach, that more men may be speedily got on shore with the field pieces. Fifthly, frigates to anchor as soon as possible after the alarm is given, or the forces are ashore near the battery in the northeast part of the bay. Sixthly, immediately as the forces are ashore, they are to get in the rear of the battery marked S in the northeast part of the bay, and to instantly storm it, and also to take post on the top of the hill which is above it. Every ship is to land the number of men as against their name expressed, with a proper proportion of officers, and the captains are at liberty to send as many more men as they please, leaving sufficient to manage the ship and to man the launch and another boat. Every captain that chooses is at liberty to land and command his seamen under the direction of Captain Trowbridge. It is recommended to put on the seamen as many marine coats or jackets as can be procured, and that all should have canvas crop belts. the Marines to be all under the order of Captain Oldfield, the senior Marine officer, and he is requested to put himself under the direction of Captain Trowbridge, as is Lieutenant Baines of the Royal Artillery with his detachment. Interesting. He's tried a little bit of a deceptive ploy there by getting as many of the sailors to look like Marines as possible. He's detailing the coordination measures that are going to be used for when vessels will be able to open fire, particularly the mortar boat. And it is to continue firing on the town. He is trying to undermine the morale of the citizens of the town by continuing the firing. And the only way that it will stop is when a flag of truce is flown. So, orders have been issued. Everyone knows what they need to do. The lads are in the boats. What we're going to do is we're going to leave it here, and we'll come back next week as we come up on H hour and the boats are about to push off on the raid of Tenerife.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.